Officer Daniel Thompson's hand froze on his radio, watching his 600-pound partner Bear do something that defied every protocol in the Denver International Airport security manual. The massive black bear had planted himself beside an abandoned suitcase and refused to move for 72 hours straight. This wasn't standard detection behavior. This was grief. Airport Director Margaret Chen stumbled backward, her clipboard clattering to the terminal floor as Bear released a sound she'd never heard from any animal before. Part roar, part sob, all anguish. Security personnel scattered, passengers pulled out phones, and the morning news crews arrived within minutes. Daniel knelt beside his partner, recognizing the same hollow look in Bear's eyes that he'd seen in his own mirror every morning since losing his family. The bear's massive paw rested protectively over the black suitcase, trembling with an emotion that seemed almost human. "Lock down Terminal B immediately," Daniel commanded, his voice cracking despite 23 years of military training. What could make a trained security bear weep over luggage? And why did Daniel feel like his heart was breaking all over again? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The controversy surrounding Bear's employment at Denver International Airport had been brewing for months before that Tuesday morning changed everything. Animal rights activists picketed weekly with signs reading, "Bears belong in forests, not airports," while veterans groups countered with, "Support our four-legged heroes." The K-9 unit's decision to expand into what they called alternative security partnerships had made national headlines, but nobody could argue with Bear's unprecedented success rate in detecting contraband. Daniel Thompson had never intended to become the face of interspecies law enforcement. At 52, the former Marine carried himself with military precision, his weathered hands steady despite the invisible tremors that came with grief. 3 years had passed since the drunk driver took his wife Margaret and 8-year-old daughter Jessica, but he still set 2 coffee cups every morning out of habit. "Roger that," remained his reflexive response to any question, a verbal tick from his deployment days that he couldn't shake. The suburban ranch house where Daniel lived alone felt too big and too quiet, filled with Jessica's artwork still taped to the refrigerator and Margaret's reading glasses left on the kitchen counter. His neighbors in the quiet Denver subdivision had grown accustomed to seeing him leave for work at 4:30 a.m. with a 600-pound bear in a custom trailer, though the sight never stopped drawing curious stares from morning joggers. Bear himself was an anomaly in every sense. Orphaned at 6 months when Colorado poachers killed his mother for her gallbladder, worth $15,000 on the black market, he'd been rescued by Daniel during a wildlife enforcement operation. The cub had been found crying over his mother's mutilated body, and something in that sound had broken through Daniel's own emotional numbness. Against all regulations and common sense, Daniel had taken the orphaned bear home. The training process had been unprecedented. Bear learned to detect narcotics, explosives, and even smuggled wildlife with an accuracy rate that embarrassed traditional K-9 units. More remarkably, he seemed to sense human emotional distress with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. During Daniel's darkest moments, when the anniversary dates hit or when he'd catch himself calling Margaret's name, Bear would appear at his side, offering silent comfort that no human had managed to provide. Dr. Catherine Morrison, the airport's wildlife veterinarian, had initially opposed the program with professional skepticism that gradually transformed into genuine amazement. At 48, recently divorced and struggling with her own empty nest syndrome since her son left for college, Kate found herself drawn to the unusual partnership between the grieving widower and his unlikely companion. Her clinical observations documented Bear's extraordinary emotional intelligence, though she struggled to explain it in scientific terms. The three of them, Daniel, Bear, and Kate, had formed an unconventional family of sorts within the sterile corridors of DIA. Their shared understanding of loss created bonds that transcended species, though none of them could have predicted how deeply those connections would be tested when Bear discovered something in Terminal B that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the price of desperation. The morning of Tuesday, April 23rd, began like any other for Daniel and Bear. Their 5:30 a.m. arrival at Denver International Airport followed the same routine they'd maintained for 18 months: equipment check, briefing with overnight security, and the first patrol sweep through Terminal B's International Arrivals section. Bear moved with practiced efficiency through the maze of conveyor belts and tired travelers, his massive frame surprisingly graceful as he navigated between suitcases and carry-on bags. Daniel had learned to read Bear's body language like a military manual. The slight tilt of his head meant narcotics detection. The deliberate sit and stare indicated explosives. The gentle paw placement suggested undeclared agricultural products. But at 6:47 a.m., near Carousel 7, where luggage from the overnight flight from Nepal circled endlessly, Bear did something Daniel had never witnessed in their years together. The bear stopped dead in his tracks, his massive head swiveling toward a lone black suitcase that had been making its lonely circuit for what appeared to be hours. Bear's hackles rose slowly, and from deep in his chest came a sound that made Daniel's blood run cold. Not the controlled growl of detection work, but something raw and primal that spoke of recognition and pain. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured, following Bear's fixed gaze to the unremarkable hardshell case. The suitcase bore no identification tags, just a barcode sticker suggesting it had passed through multiple airports. But Bear approached it as if drawn by invisible strings, his usual professional demeanor replaced by something Daniel could only describe as mourning. Bear lowered himself to the ground beside the suitcase and refused to move. Airport employees tried to continue their work around him, but the 600-pound bear had effectively claimed the space. When Daniel attempted to call him away for their next scheduled sweep, Bear responded with a whimper so human-like that several passing passengers stopped to stare. "I'd never heard him make that sound before," Daniel would later tell investigators. "It was like he was crying." The situation escalated rapidly. Terminal B's operations manager, a stern woman named Patricia Hawkins, who'd opposed the Bear program from its inception, arrived with backup security and a barely concealed sense of vindication. "I want that animal removed immediately," she declared, jabbing her finger toward Bear. "This is exactly why wild animals don't belong in airports." But Bear wouldn't budge. For the first time in his career, he ignored Daniel's commands entirely. The massive bear remained stretched beside the suitcase, one enormous paw resting protectively against its side. His dark eyes held a depth of emotion that unsettled everyone who looked into them. "Doctor." Kate Morrison arrived within the hour, summoned by Daniel's increasingly desperate radio calls. She found Bear in the same position, having refused both food and water. His vital signs were elevated, his stress indicators off the charts, but physically he appeared unharmed. "I've never seen behavior like this," Kate admitted, crouching at a safe distance to observe Bear's posture. "It's almost like he's guarding something precious." The crowd grew throughout the morning. Airport security established a perimeter around Carousel 7, redirecting foot traffic while news crews gathered outside the terminal. Social media exploded with grainy cell phone videos of the massive bear maintaining his vigil. Bear Vigil began trending within hours, dividing public opinion between those who saw a touching display of animal emotion and those who viewed it as proof that bears had no place in airport security. Patricia Hawkins made increasingly urgent calls to her superiors. "We have a full-scale disruption in Terminal B," she reported. "That bear is holding our operations hostage over a piece of luggage." Federal aviation authorities demanded explanations. Animal rights activists saw vindication of their protests. The story had grown beyond Denver, beyond Colorado, becoming a national debate about the ethics of working animals. But Daniel noticed something others missed. Every few hours, Bear would shift position slightly, always maintaining contact with the suitcase. His breathing pattern suggested he was scenting something specific, something that triggered deep memories. During his military service in Afghanistan, Daniel had witnessed bomb dogs react similarly to IEDs that reminded them of previous traumatic encounters. "What if he's not just detecting something?" Daniel suggested to Kate, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the terminal. "What if he's remembering something?" Kate knelt beside Bear, her trained eye cataloging his stress responses. "Animals don't grieve over objects," she said, but her voice carried uncertainty. "They grieve over loss of pack members, over trauma, over—" She stopped mid-sentence, her face paling as a terrible possibility occurred to her. Rising quickly, Kate examined the suitcase more closely, running her fingers along its edges until she found what made her gasp. Tiny holes, barely visible, drilled strategically around the case's perimeter. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice tight with horror. "These aren't random holes, they're ventilation." Bear's vigil suddenly made devastating sense. The discovery of ventilation holes transformed the atmosphere in Terminal B from curious spectacle to urgent crisis. Kate's veterinary training kicked into overdrive as she traced the tiny perforations with her fingertip, counting at least a dozen deliberately drilled openings around the suitcase's perimeter. "These holes were made by someone who knows about live animal transport," she told Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who wanted whatever's inside to survive the journey." Daniel's military instincts sharpened instantly. "How long has this case been sitting here unclaimed?" he demanded, pulling out his radio to contact baggage services. The answer chilled him. 5 days. 5 days of continuous circulation on Carousel 7, with Bear's unprecedented vigil beginning only when he'd first encountered it Tuesday morning. Whatever was inside had been without proper care, food, or water for nearly a week. Patricia Hawkins arrived with Federal Aviation Authority representatives and a TSA explosives team, but Kate intercepted them before they could approach. "If there are live animals in there," she said firmly, "we need to handle this as a veterinary emergency, not a security threat. Every minute we waste following protocol could mean the difference between life and death." The bureaucratic machinery of airport security ground against the urgency of potential animal rescue. Federal regulations required specific procedures for suspicious packages. Chain of custody protocols demanded documentation. Insurance liability concerns paralyzed decision-making while precious time ticked away. Bear, meanwhile, had positioned himself so that his body heat warmed one side of the suitcase, an instinctive behavior that suggested his deep understanding of the situation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from that luggage," ordered TSA Supervisor James Mueller, a by-the-book official who'd arrived with a mobile X-ray unit. His scanner revealed dense organic shapes inside the case, but the images were inconclusive. Could be contraband, could be biological weapons, could be anything. Kate's frustration boiled over. "Those shapes have heartbeats," she snapped, pressing her stethoscope against the suitcase's surface. The sound that emerged, faint, rapid, desperate, confirmed her worst fears. "I can hear them breathing. They're alive, and they're dying." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but an unexpected arrival shifted the dynamic entirely. Dr. Eleanor Ashford appeared at the security perimeter carrying an impressive set of credentials identifying her as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist. At 67, she possessed the authoritative bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in crisis situations. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her gentle eyes held the compassion of someone who'd dedicated her life to saving others. "I received a call about a potential wildlife emergency," Eleanor announced, presenting her identification to the gathered officials. Her 40-year career as a pediatric nurse at Denver Children's Hospital had taught her to project calm authority in chaotic situations, and that training served her well now. "I've handled hundreds of exotic animal rescues. Whatever's in that suitcase needs immediate veterinary attention." Daniel studied the newcomer with the suspicious eye of a former Marine. Something about her timing seemed too convenient, her arrival too perfectly orchestrated. But Eleanor's credentials checked out, and her knowledge of exotic animal care appeared genuine. More importantly, Bear's reaction to her presence was telling. The massive bear remained protective of the suitcase, but showed no aggression toward Eleanor personally. "Dr. Ashford," Kate said, relief evident in her voice. "I'm Dr. Morrison, DIA's veterinary specialist. I believe we're dealing with illegally transported live animals, possibly exotic species based on the transport method." Eleanor's face went pale at the word illegal, but she recovered quickly. "In my experience, animals smuggled in luggage are usually young mammals, cubs or juveniles small enough to fit in standard suitcases. The mortality rate for this kind of transport is horrific. Every minute we delay decreases their survival chances exponentially." The crowd of officials, media representatives, and curious onlookers had grown throughout the day, creating a circus atmosphere that complicated any rescue attempt. News helicopters circled overhead while protesters gathered outside the terminal, some supporting Bear's vigil, others demanding the immediate opening of the suitcase. Social media had transformed the situation into a national debate about animal rights, airport security, and the ethics of using bears in law enforcement. But it was a phone call that changed everything. Eleanor's cell phone rang at 4:17 p.m., and the conversation Daniel overheard chilled him to the bone. "Yes, Tyler, I understand the surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Eleanor said, her voice strained. "Grandma's handling something important right now, but I'll be there soon." When she hung up, tears glistened in her eyes. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Daniel asked, his protective instincts extending beyond Bear to anyone clearly in distress. Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "My grandson," she whispered. "He's 12 years old and he's very sick. Tomorrow morning he has surgery that could save his life, and I promised I'd be there." She looked at the suitcase, then at Bear, then back at Daniel. "But I can't leave knowing there are animals suffering in there." The human drama suddenly overshadowed the procedural delays. Daniel saw something in Eleanor's eyes that he recognized from his own mirror. The desperate determination of someone fighting to save what mattered most. "What kind of surgery?" he asked gently. "Experimental treatment for a rare genetic disorder," Eleanor replied, her voice barely audible. "The insurance company called it investigational and refused to cover it. We've spent everything, our savings, borrowed against the house, maxed out credit cards, $2.8 million, and we're still short." Kate's heart broke listening to Eleanor's story. Her own recent divorce had left her financially strained, and she couldn't imagine facing such devastating medical bills. "There has to be something." "There's nothing," Eleanor cut her off. "Nothing legal, anyway." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Daniel felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Bear suddenly became agitated, rising to all fours and circling the suitcase while making the same mournful sounds that had started the entire crisis. His massive head swiveled between Eleanor and the case, as if trying to communicate something urgent that none of the humans understood. "He knows," Eleanor said softly, watching Bear's behavior with growing alarm. "Somehow, he knows what's in there." Daniel's military training had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to spiral beyond control. The combination of media attention, bureaucratic paralysis, obvious animal suffering, And now Eleanor's personal crisis created a perfect storm of competing pressures. Someone was going to make a decision soon. The only question was whether it would be the right one. "Dr. Ashford," he said quietly, "whatever's about to happen here, I need you to tell me the truth. Do you know what's in that suitcase?" Eleanor's eyes met his, and in that moment Daniel saw not deception, but the terrible weight of impossible choices. Eleanor's silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was told they were rescue animals being relocated to a sanctuary," she said, unable to meet Daniel's eyes. 3 red panda cubs from a breeding facility in Nepal that was being shut down. The transport company said they needed someone with medical experience to monitor the journey, ensure they stayed sedated during the flight. Kate stepped closer, her veterinary instincts screaming that something wasn't right about Eleanor's story. "Red pandas are critically endangered," she said carefully. "International transport requires extensive permits, veterinary oversight, quarantine protocols. Who exactly hired you for this job?" The question hung in the air as Eleanor's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Daniel watched her shoulders sag under the weight of what appeared to be crushing guilt. "A company called Wildlife Preservation International," she finally admitted. "They contacted me 3 weeks ago through the hospital, said they'd heard about Tyler's condition and wanted to offer me a way to earn money for his treatment while helping endangered animals." Daniel's military experience had exposed him to enough criminal enterprises to recognize the sophisticated manipulation behind Eleanor's recruitment. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that sounds like someone researched your situation and targeted you specifically. How much were they paying you for this transport job?" Eleanor's face flushed with shame. $300,000, she whispered. "Enough to cover the shortfall for Tyler's surgery with money left over for recovery expenses." The astronomical sum confirmed Daniel's worst suspicions. No legitimate wildlife preservation organization paid that kind of money for transport assistance, especially to someone without professional animal handling credentials. "Dr. Ashford, I think you've been deceived by people involved in illegal wildlife trafficking." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She staggered backward, one hand pressed to her chest as the full implications of Daniel's statement sank in. "No," she breathed. "No, they showed me documentation. They said the cubs were going to a breeding facility in Colorado, that this was perfectly legal conservation work." Bear's agitation increased as Eleanor's distress mounted. The massive bear began pacing in tight circles around the suitcase, his vocalizations growing more urgent. Kate knelt beside him, trying to provide calming contact while monitoring his stress levels. "Daniel, whatever's in that case, Bear's emotional state is deteriorating rapidly. If we don't do something soon, we might lose him to psychological trauma." The comparison to combat veterans suffering from PTSD wasn't lost on Daniel. He'd seen fellow Marines break down when triggers activated traumatic memories, and Bear's behavior suggested something similar. "Kate, you mentioned that animals can remember traumatic scents. What if Bear's reacting to something connected to his mother's death?" Eleanor's complexion turned ashen at Daniel's words. "What do you mean about his mother?" "Poachers killed Bear's mother when he was 6 months old," Daniel explained, watching Eleanor's reaction carefully. "They used tranquilizer drugs to subdue her before they harvested her organs for the black market. Bear was found crying over her body." The revelation shattered Eleanor's remaining composure. "Oh, God," she sobbed, sinking to her knees. "They told me the cubs were just sedated for transport, standard procedure to reduce stress during long flights." But if Bear recognizes the scent of those drugs, Kate's veterinary training allowed her to piece together the horrific picture. "Eleanor, how long ago were these cubs supposed to be sedated, and what specific drugs were used?" 5 days ago before the flight from Nepal, Eleanor replied through tears. The handler gave me a syringe and told me to administer additional doses if the cubs became restless during transport. He said it was a mild tranquilizer, perfectly safe. Daniel felt sick as he realized the timeline. Ma'am, those cubs have been drugged and confined in that suitcase for 5 days without food, water, or proper ventilation. If they're still alive, they're suffering from severe dehydration, hypothermia, and possible organ failure. The group fell silent as the full horror of the situation became clear. Eleanor had been manipulated into participating in a crime that resulted in prolonged animal torture, while Bear's traumatic memories had been triggered by the scent of dying cubs that reminded him of his mother's murder. The suitcase had become a symbol of everything wrong with the illegal wildlife trade: greed, deception, and the callous exploitation of both animals and desperate humans. Patricia Hawkins chose that moment to return with airport executives and federal authorities, demanding immediate resolution of what she termed the Bear situation. "I don't care what's in that suitcase," she announced. "We're opening it now and removing this animal from our facility permanently." "You don't understand," Kate protested, rising to block access to the case. "Opening that suitcase improperly could kill whatever's inside. We need veterinary equipment, warming protocols, emergency medications. We need this circus ended," Patricia cut her off. "The FAA is threatening to revoke our security certifications if we don't restore normal operations immediately." Eleanor stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with painful clarity. "I'll tell you everything," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'll cooperate fully with federal investigators, testify against the trafficking organization, whatever you need. But please, let Dr. Morrison try to save those cubs first. They're innocent victims, just like Tyler." Daniel felt a surge of respect for Eleanor's courage in the face of certain criminal prosecution. Her willingness to sacrifice herself for the cubs reminded him of the selfless spirit he'd witnessed among the best military personnel he'd served with. "Ma'am, I believe you were a victim too," he said firmly, "and I'm going to do everything in my power to help you save those animals and your grandson." The bureaucratic deadlock might have continued indefinitely, but Bear made the decision for them. The massive bear suddenly stood, walked deliberately to the suitcase's clasps, and began manipulating them with surprising dexterity. His actions were purposeful, careful, almost reverent, as if he understood the fragility of whatever lay inside. "He's opening it," Kate whispered in amazement. "Bear's opening the suitcase himself." Daniel moved quickly to support his partner, knowing that Bear's instincts about animal welfare had never been wrong. "Clear the area," he commanded the gathered officials. "Give Dr. Morrison space to work if there are injured animals inside." Eleanor positioned herself beside Kate, her pediatric nursing experience automatically kicking in despite the different species involved. "I have basic veterinary supplies in my car," she offered. "IV fluids, warming blankets, emergency medications. I brought them in case the cubs needed medical attention during transport." The admission that Eleanor had prepared for potential medical emergencies actually supported her claim that she'd believed this was legitimate rescue work. Someone planning to harm animals wouldn't have invested in their medical care. Kate nodded gratefully. "Get everything you have. If these cubs are alive, we'll need every resource available." Bear stepped back as the first clasp released, his massive body trembling with emotion. Daniel had never seen his partner display such human-like anxiety, and the sight broke his heart. "Easy, boy," he murmured, placing a calming hand on Bear's shoulder. "We're going to help them, whatever we find." The second clasp opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet terminal. Media representatives pressed closer despite security cordons, their cameras capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Social media exploded with real-time updates as hashtag #SaveTheCubs joined #BearVigil in trending worldwide. Eleanor returned with a medical bag that rivaled most emergency room supplies, her nursing background evident in her efficient organization of IV equipment, warming devices, and emergency drugs. "Tyler always said I was overprepared for everything," she said sadly. "I guess my grandson was right." Kate positioned herself at the head of the suitcase while Daniel maintained crowd control and Eleanor prepared medical supplies. Bear settled into a protective posture, his massive presence serving as both guardian and witness to whatever they were about to discover. The moment of truth had arrived, 5 days after 3 innocent cubs had begun a journey that was supposed to end in their salvation, but had instead become a nightmare of suffering and exploitation. As Kate's hands moved toward the final latch, everyone present understood they were about to witness either a miraculous rescue or a heartbreaking tragedy. Bear's low whimper filled the silence, a sound that spoke of remembered loss and the desperate hope for redemption. The final latch opened with a whisper-soft click that seemed to reverberate through the suddenly hushed terminal. Kate lifted the suitcase lid slowly, her veterinary training warring with her human emotions as the smell hit them first. A nauseating mixture of urine, feces, fear, and something else that made Bear rear back on his hind legs with a sound of pure anguish. Inside the suitcase, nestled in soiled newspaper and shredded fabric, lay 3 red panda cubs. 2 were barely moving, their rust-colored fur matted and dull, their tiny rib cages rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths that spoke of severe distress. The third lay motionless, its small body already stiffening with death. "Jesus Christ," Daniel whispered, his military composure cracking as he stared at the innocent victims of human greed. "They're just babies." Eleanor's medical training overrode her emotional shock as she knelt beside the suitcase. "The 2 that are breathing, we can save them," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "But we need to move fast. They're severely dehydrated and hypothermic." Kate was already reaching for the smallest living cub, a female with distinctive white markings around her ears. The tiny animal's body temperature was dangerously low, her pulse thread and erratic. "This one's critical," Kate announced, wrapping the cub in warming blankets from Eleanor's medical bag. "We need IV fluids immediately." Bear approached the suitcase with heartbreaking gentleness, his massive head lowering to sniff the deceased cub. The sound that emerged from his throat defied description, part mourning cry, part protective growl, all grief. Daniel had heard similar sounds from combat veterans discovering fallen comrades, and the parallel made his chest tighten with shared pain. The second living cub, slightly larger than his sister, responded to Kate's touch with a weak mewling sound that was barely audible. Eleanor immediately began establishing an IV line with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed the procedure thousands of times on human children. "His blood pressure is critically low," she reported, her nursing instincts seamlessly adapting to the different anatomy. "But he's fighting. They're both fighters." Airport security had established a wider perimeter as news crews and curious passengers pressed closer, their cameras capturing every moment of the dramatic rescue attempt. Patricia Hawkins stood at the edge of the restricted area, her face pale as she witnessed the reality of what had been hidden in her terminal for 5 days. The bureaucratic concerns about security protocols seemed suddenly trivial compared to the life-and-death struggle playing out before her eyes. Federal wildlife agents arrived within minutes, their expressions grim as they documented the crime scene while Kate and Eleanor worked to stabilize the surviving cubs. Agent Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran of wildlife trafficking investigations, knelt beside the deceased cub with practiced solemnity. "Based on decomposition patterns, this one died approximately 18 to 24 hours ago," she announced. "The others are incredibly lucky to still be alive." Daniel felt rage building in his chest as he absorbed the full scope of the crime. These weren't just statistics in a wildlife trafficking report. They were individual animals who'd been torn from their mothers, drugged into unconsciousness, and transported like cargo across international borders. The survivor's fight for life reminded him painfully of his own daughter's final hours in the hospital, when every breath had been a victory against impossible odds. Eleanor worked with quiet determination, her hands steady as she administered warming IV fluids to the male cub. "I've treated hundreds of sick children," she said softly, "but somehow this feels different. These babies never asked to be part of this horror." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that Eleanor, a woman who'd been deceived into participating in the cub's suffering, was now fighting desperately to save them. Kate observed Eleanor's professional competence with growing respect, recognizing someone who understood that healing transcended species boundaries. Bear had positioned himself as a living shield around the rescue area, his massive presence both protecting the cubs and providing radiant body heat to supplement the warming blankets. His behavior suggested an understanding of the situation that went beyond simple animal instinct. He seemed to grasp that these cubs represented a chance for redemption, a way to honor his mother's memory through protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. The female cub, whom Kate had privately begun calling Hope, showed the first signs of improvement after 30 minutes of intensive care. Her breathing became less labored, her tiny eyes fluttered open briefly, and she managed to take small amounts of electrolyte solution from a syringe. "She's responding," Kate announced, her voice thick with emotion. "Body temperature's rising. Pulse is strengthening." The male cub's recovery proved more challenging. Despite Eleanor's expert care, his vital signs remained dangerously unstable. "He's older, which means he's been conscious longer during the transport," Eleanor explained grimly. "More aware of the trauma, more psychologically damaged." Agent Martinez completed her preliminary investigation and approached Daniel with update that made his blood boil. "Based on documentation we found in the deceased cub's fur, this shipment originated from a wildlife preserve in Nepal that was raided last week. These cubs were stolen from their mothers and smuggled through Thailand, China, and Mexico before reaching Denver." The revelation that the cubs had been literally kidnapped from a legitimate conservation facility added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking situation. Daniel thought of Bear's own violent separation from his mother and felt the connection between past and present trauma that seemed to drive his partner's emotional investment in the rescue. Media attention intensified as word spread through social networks about the dramatic rescue attempt. Save the Cubs exploded across platforms, with real-time updates drawing millions of viewers worldwide. The story had evolved beyond a simple airport security incident into a powerful symbol of the wildlife trafficking crisis that claimed thousands of endangered animals annually. Eleanor's phone rang insistently, calls from the hospital about Tyler's pre-surgical preparations. Each ignored ring seemed to physically pain her, but she never wavered in her focus on the cub's medical needs. "Tyler would understand," she murmured to Kate during a brief lull in treatment. "He's always loved animals. He'd want me to save them." The ethical complexity of Eleanor's situation wasn't lost on the federal agents documenting her cooperation. Agent Martinez privately told Daniel that Eleanor's medical expertise and obvious genuine remorse would likely result in reduced charges, but federal wildlife trafficking laws carried mandatory minimum sentences that could still separate her from Tyler during the most critical period of his recovery. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, hope continued to improve while her brother remained critically unstable. Kate made the difficult decision to transport him to the National Wildlife Research Center's emergency facility in Fort Collins, where specialized equipment might give him a fighting chance. "We've done everything we can here," she told Eleanor with deep regret. "He needs more advanced care than we can provide." Bear seemed to understand that separation was imminent. He approached the male cub with infinite gentleness, lowering his massive head to touch the tiny animal's body in what could only be described as a blessing. The gesture moved even the hardened federal agents to silence, recognizing something profound in the connection between the orphaned bear and the trafficked cubs. Eleanor made the heartbreaking decision to accompany the male cub to Fort Collins, despite knowing it would mean missing Tyler's surgery preparation. "I got these babies into this situation," she said firmly. "I'm going to see them through to whatever comes next." Daniel watched Eleanor's choice with deep respect, recognizing the courage it took to prioritize the cub's welfare over her own desperate need to be with Tyler. The decision marked her transformation from unwitting accomplice to active advocate for the animals she'd inadvertently helped harm. As emergency transport vehicles arrived to move the male cub, Bear's vigil finally ended. He had discovered the suitcase, protected its contents, and witnessed their rescue. His work was complete, but the emotional cost was evident in his exhausted posture and the deep sadness that seemed to emanate from his very soul. The climax had passed, but the true test of survival was just beginning. The male cub, whom Eleanor had quietly named Courage during the tense transport to Fort Collins, fought for his life throughout the night in the National Wildlife Research Center's intensive care unit. Despite the facility's state-of-the-art equipment and round-the-clock monitoring, his vital signs continued to deteriorate. The combination of prolonged drug exposure, severe dehydration, and psychological trauma had pushed his small body beyond its limits. Eleanor maintained her vigil beside Courage's incubator, her experienced hands adjusting IV drips and monitoring equipment with the precision of someone who'd spent 40 years in pediatric medicine. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the facility's chief veterinarian, watched Eleanor work with growing admiration for the older woman's dedication. "I've rarely seen such commitment from someone who isn't professionally involved with wildlife," she observed quietly. "These cubs are my responsibility now," Eleanor replied, without taking her eyes off Courage's labored breathing. "I failed them once by trusting the wrong people. I won't fail them again." Meanwhile, at Denver International Airport, Hope's condition had stabilized enough for Kate to establish a temporary care station in the veterinary facility. The female cub showed remarkable resilience, taking small amounts of specialized formula and responding to gentle stimulation. Bear had taken up residence outside the treatment room, refusing to leave, despite Daniel's attempts to maintain their normal routine. At 3:47 a.m., Eleanor's worst fears materialized. Courage's breathing became increasingly erratic despite maximum life support intervention. His tiny heart, weakened by days of chemical stress and trauma, began failing. Eleanor held the dying cub in her hands, feeling his life slip away as she whispered apologies and prayers in equal measure. "I'm so sorry, little one," she sobbed as Courage's breathing stopped. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." Dr. Walsh's necropsy revealed the full extent of the trafficking operation's cruelty. Courage had been subjected to multiple drug injections during transport, his small body bearing needle marks from repeated sedation attempts. The chemical cocktail used to keep him unconscious had caused organ damage that made survival impossible even with immediate medical intervention. The news of Courage's death reached Daniel and Kate at the airport, where they were monitoring Hope's continued recovery. Bear seemed to sense the loss without being told, releasing a low, mournful cry that echoed through the empty terminal corridors. Daniel had never seen his partner display such profound grief over an animal he'd never directly interacted with, but the connection ran deeper than physical contact. Eleanor's phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from Denver Children's Hospital. Tyler's surgery had been moved up to 8 a.m. due to a deterioration in his condition. The medical team needed her consent for last-minute procedure modifications, and Tyler was asking for his grandmother's presence before going under anesthesia. The cruel timing forced Eleanor to make an impossible choice. Stay with Hope and see the surviving cub through her critical recovery period, or rush back to Denver for Tyler's surgery with no guarantee she'd make it in time. Dr. Walsh found Eleanor sitting in the facility's chapel at 4:30 a.m., staring at her phone while tears streamed down her face. "Go," Dr. Walsh said gently. "We'll take excellent care of Hope. Your grandson needs you now." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "If I leave Hope now, I'm abandoning her just like those traffickers abandoned all 3 cubs. Tyler has a whole medical team fighting for him. Hope just has us." The decision revealed the depth of Eleanor's transformation from unwitting accomplice to fierce advocate. Dr. Walsh respected her choice while privately calling Daniel to explain the situation. Daniel immediately grasped the profound sacrifice Eleanor was making and felt compelled to act. "Kate, can Hope be transported safely?" he asked. "Because I have an idea that might help everyone." Within hours, Daniel had coordinated with hospital administration to bring Hope to Denver Children's Hospital in a portable intensive care unit. The plan was medically risky but emotionally necessary. Eleanor could monitor Hope's recovery while remaining close to Tyler during his surgery. The hospital's board initially resisted having a wild animal on premises, but Eleanor's 4 decades of service and the extraordinary circumstances swayed their decision. Tyler Ashford, despite his own medical crisis, became fascinated by Hope's story when Eleanor explained the situation. The 12-year-old's eyes lit up when he learned about the cub's survival against impossible odds. "She's like me, isn't she, Grandma?" he said weakly. "Fighting for her life even when everyone thought she might not make it." The parallel between the sick boy and the rescued cub wasn't lost on anyone present. Both were fighting battles they hadn't chosen, both dependent on the love and determination of those around them. Tyler insisted on seeing Hope before his surgery, and the brief encounter between the dying child and the recovering cub created a moment of profound connection that moved hardened medical professionals to tears. Eleanor's world collapsed further when Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Tyler's surgeon, delivered devastating news. "The latest scans show more extensive tumor involvement than we initially detected," she explained gravely. "The experimental procedure has a lower success rate than we hoped, perhaps 30% survival probability." The odds were far worse than Eleanor had been led to believe. Her life savings, her house, her reputation, all sacrificed for a procedure that was unlikely to save Tyler's life. The weight of financial and emotional devastation would have crushed most people, but Eleanor found unexpected strength in Hope's continued recovery. Tyler's surgery began at 8:15 a.m. with Eleanor maintaining vigil in the waiting room while monitoring Hope's vital signs in the portable unit beside her. The cub had grown stronger throughout the night, her appetite returning and her responses becoming more alert. The contrast between Tyler's declining condition and Hope's improving health created a bittersweet dynamic that Eleanor struggled to process. The surgery stretched for 8 grueling hours. Eleanor dozed fitfully in her chair, one hand resting on Hope's carrier while her phone remained silent except for periodic updates from the operating room. Kate and Daniel arrived mid-morning to provide support, bringing Bear with them despite hospital regulations. The massive Bear's presence in the pediatric wing caused quite a stir, but Tyler's medical team recognized the therapeutic value of emotional support animals. At 4:23 p.m., Dr. Hendricks emerged from the operating room with an expression Eleanor couldn't read. The surgeon's scrubs were stained with blood, her face drawn with exhaustion from the complex procedure. Eleanor rose slowly, preparing herself for the worst possible news. "The surgery went better than expected," Dr. Hendricks said carefully. "We were able to remove more tumor tissue than anticipated, and Tyler's vital signs remained stable throughout. But—" the word "but" hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor felt her knees weaken as she waited for the crushing blow that would complete her destruction. "But the pathology results won't be available for 72 hours," Dr. Hendricks continued. "We won't know if we achieved complete tumor removal until then. The next 3 days will determine Tyler's prognosis." Eleanor collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed by the reprieve. Tyler was alive, the surgery was complete, and there was still hope for recovery. Hope, like the small red panda who had become a symbol of survival against impossible odds. As if responding to the emotional intensity around her, Hope suddenly opened her eyes fully for the first time since her rescue. The tiny cub looked directly at Eleanor with bright, alert intelligence that seemed to convey understanding beyond her species. In that moment, Eleanor felt a connection that transcended the guilt and trauma of the past week. The tragedy wasn't over. Tyler's survival remained uncertain. Legal consequences awaited Eleanor's cooperation with federal investigators, and the broader wildlife trafficking network continued to operate. But in the quiet moments of twilight, watching Hope grow stronger while Tyler began his own recovery journey, Eleanor discovered that love and hope could coexist with loss and uncertainty. The real test of survival was just beginning, but for the first time in weeks, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that both Tyler and Hope might have a future worth fighting for. The truth began unraveling 72 hours after Tyler's surgery, but not in the way anyone expected. Eleanor sat beside her grandson's hospital bed, watching Hope explore a larger enclosure that the pediatric staff had constructed in Tyler's room. The red panda cub had grown remarkably stronger, her playful curiosity providing entertainment for Tyler during his painful recovery period. Dr. Hendricks had delayed delivering the pathology results, claiming she needed additional consultation with specialists. Eleanor sensed evasion in the surgeon's manner, but attributed it to caution given the experimental nature of Tyler's treatment. What she didn't expect was Tyler himself to uncover the deception that would shatter her understanding of everything. "Grandma," Tyler said weakly from his hospital bed, "I've been researching my condition online. The survival rates for my type of tumor are actually much higher than Dr. Hendricks told us." Eleanor looked up from monitoring Hope's feeding schedule, confused by Tyler's statement. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't be worrying about medical statistics. Focus on getting better." Tyler held up his tablet with the determination of a 12-year-old who'd discovered adult deception. "Look at this, Grandma. The National Cancer Institute says experimental treatments for my specific tumor have an 85% success rate, not 30% like Dr. Hendricks said." The numbers hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She took Tyler's tablet with trembling hands, reading research papers that contradicted everything the medical team had told her about his prognosis. The experimental procedure Tyler had undergone was not a desperate last resort. It was actually the preferred treatment protocol with excellent outcomes when performed at specialized pediatric cancer centers. "Tyler, where did you find this information?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely steady. "I started researching after hearing nurses talking about how unusual it was for our insurance to reject coverage for such a standard procedure," Tyler replied. "Grandma, I think someone's been lying to us." Eleanor's mind raced as implications crystallized. If Tyler's treatment was considered standard rather than experimental, insurance coverage should have been automatic. The financial desperation that drove her to accept the trafficking job had been based on deliberate misinformation designed to exploit her situation. Agent Martinez arrived for Eleanor's scheduled interview regarding the federal trafficking investigation, but found her in a state of controlled fury rather than resigned cooperation. "Agent Martinez, I need you to investigate something beyond the wildlife trafficking charges," Eleanor said, her voice tight with anger. "I believe my grandson and I have been victims of medical fraud designed to force me into criminal activity." The revelation transformed the entire dynamic of the federal investigation. Agent Martinez listened with growing alarm as Eleanor presented evidence of the systematic deception surrounding Tyler's medical care. Hospital billing records showed procedures coded as experimental when they were actually standard treatment protocols. Insurance denials cited investigational status for treatments that had been FDA approved for years. Mrs. Ashford, what you're describing sounds like organized healthcare fraud, Agent Martinez said grimly. Someone deliberately created your financial crisis to make you vulnerable to recruitment by the trafficking organization. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal agents delved into the hospital's financial records and insurance processing procedures. What they discovered was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that identified families with seriously ill children, manipulated their medical bills to create artificial financial crises, then recruited desperate parents for various illegal activities ranging from drug smuggling to wildlife trafficking. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Tyler's surgeon, had been a key player in the scheme. Her deliberate misrepresentation of Tyler's prognosis and treatment options had been designed to maximize Eleanor's desperation and financial vulnerability. The experimental procedures she recommended carried inflated price tags that enriched both the hospital and her personal consulting fees. Tyler absorbed this information with the resilience of youth, but Eleanor struggled with the magnitude of the deception. I nearly destroyed my life and those cubs' lives because I trusted doctors who were deliberately lying to me, she said, watching Hope play contentedly in her enclosure. How many other families have they victimized? The answer proved staggering. Federal investigators uncovered evidence of at least 47 families who'd been similarly manipulated over the past 3 years. Parents had been recruited for money laundering, drug transport, identity theft, and various forms of trafficking, all driven by artificially created medical debt for their children's treatment. Eleanor's cooperation with the expanded investigation became crucial for dismantling the entire criminal network. Her detailed testimony about the recruitment process, the false medical information she'd received, and the specific individuals involved provided prosecutors with evidence needed to pursue racketeering charges against the hospital administrators and corrupt medical staff. But the emotional cost remained devastating. Eleanor had spent her life savings, mortgaged her home, and damaged her reputation based on lies designed to exploit her love for Tyler. Even with the truth revealed, financial recovery would take years, while the emotional trauma might never fully heal. Tyler, however, demonstrated remarkable wisdom for his age. "Grandma, you did everything because you love me," he said during one of Eleanor's darker moments. "The bad people took advantage of that love, but that doesn't make your love wrong." Hope's continued recovery provided unexpected therapy for both Eleanor and Tyler. The Red Panda cub's playful antics and growing strength served as daily reminders that survival was possible even after terrible trauma. Kate visited regularly to monitor Hope's development, often bringing Daniel and Bear, whose presence created an unconventional but healing family dynamic. Bear's interaction with Hope revealed the depth of interspecies emotional connection that had initially drawn Eleanor into legitimate wildlife conservation work. The massive bear displayed infinite gentleness with the tiny cub, often positioning himself as a living windbreak during Hope's outdoor exercise periods in the hospital's therapeutic garden. Dr. Hendricks was arrested during Tyler's 4th day of recovery. Her perp walk past the pediatric ward witnessed by staff who'd unknowingly participated in her fraudulent schemes. The sight of their trusted colleague being led away in handcuffs created shockwaves throughout Denver Children's Hospital as the scope of the corruption became clear. Tyler's actual prognosis, delivered by an independent oncologist brought in to review his case, was overwhelmingly positive. The surgery had been completely successful, the tumor was entirely removed, and his long-term survival probability exceeded 90% with standard follow-up treatment. The experimental procedures Dr. Hendricks had recommended were unnecessary complications designed to inflate billing rather than improve outcomes. "Tyler is essentially cured," the new oncologist told Eleanor with a smile. "The treatment he received was exactly what he needed, despite the fraudulent circumstances surrounding it. His recovery should be complete within 6 to 8 weeks." The news should have brought pure joy, but Eleanor struggled with complex emotions about the path that had led to Tyler's healing. If I hadn't been deceived into the trafficking job, would Tyler still have received the surgery he needed? She wondered aloud to Kate during one of their conversations. Kate's response carried the wisdom of someone who'd witnessed both animal and human resilience. "Eleanor, sometimes terrible things happen that lead to necessary outcomes through impossible paths. Tyler is healing, Hope is thriving, and a criminal network has been dismantled. That doesn't justify the suffering, but it gives meaning to your choices." The federal trafficking investigation expanded internationally as Eleanor's testimony led authorities to the broader network that had exploited dozens of families across multiple states. Wildlife Preservation International proved to be a front organization for traffickers who specialized in recruiting desperate parents with medical expertise, using their legitimate credentials to transport illegal animals through customs checkpoints. Eleanor's charges were reduced to a single misdemeanor count of unknowing participation in wildlife trafficking, with sentencing deferred pending her continued cooperation with the ongoing investigation. The reduction reflected prosecutors' recognition that she had been as much a victim as a perpetrator in the sophisticated criminal scheme. Tyler's recovery accelerated as the truth emerged, his body responding to both medical treatment and the relief of understanding what had actually happened to their family. Hope's presence in his hospital room created a therapeutic environment that amazed medical staff, with the Cubs' playful energy encouraging Tyler's own physical rehabilitation. As Tyler prepared for discharge after 2 weeks of recovery, Eleanor faced the complexity of rebuilding a life shattered by deception and criminal manipulation. The financial damage would take years to repair, her reputation required rehabilitation, and the emotional trauma of the trafficking experience would need ongoing processing. But watching Tyler laugh at Hope's antics while Bear dozed protectively nearby, Eleanor discovered that healing could begin even before justice was complete. The truth had finally emerged, but the real work of recovery was just beginning for everyone involved. 6 months after Tyler's surgery and Hope's rescue, Eleanor stood in the morning sunlight of the Rocky Mountain Wildlife Sanctuary, watching her grandson feed the now thriving red panda, while Bear dozed contentedly in the shade nearby. The transformation in all their lives seemed almost miraculous, though Eleanor knew the healing had come through deliberate choices rather than chance. Tyler had made a complete recovery, his follow-up scans showing no trace of the tumor that had once threatened his life. More importantly, the experience had awakened in him a passionate commitment to wildlife conservation that gave new purpose to everything their family had endured. At 13, he'd already raised over $50,000 for anti-trafficking efforts through school presentations about Hope's story. "Grandma, watch this," Tyler called out, offering Hope a piece of bamboo. The red panda, now weighing nearly 4 pounds and displaying the confident curiosity of a healthy juvenile, accepted the treat with the dignified grace that had charmed everyone at the sanctuary. Hope had become an ambassador for her species, her rescue story inspiring thousands of visitors to support conservation efforts. Eleanor's community service sentence had evolved into something far more meaningful than court-mandated punishment. Her 800 hours at the sanctuary had reconnected her with the genuine wildlife conservation work she'd thought she was doing when first recruited by the traffickers. Dr. Rebecca Walsh had offered her a permanent position as the sanctuary's volunteer coordinator, recognizing Eleanor's unique ability to connect with visitors who'd faced their own desperate circumstances. The financial recovery had been slower but steady. Eleanor's house had been saved from foreclosure through a combination of restitution from the convicted hospital administrators and donations from supporters who'd followed Tyler and Hope's story. The experimental treatment costs had been covered entirely by insurance once the fraud was exposed, with Eleanor receiving additional compensation for the emotional trauma inflicted by the deliberate deception. Daniel had found his own healing through the expanded animal therapy program he'd developed with Kate at Denver International Airport. Bear's extraordinary empathy had proven so valuable that 3 other airports had implemented similar programs, with Daniel serving as a national consultant for interspecies therapeutic partnerships. The work gave deeper meaning to his military service background, while honoring the memory of his wife and daughter. Kate had surprised herself by falling in love not just with the work, but with Daniel himself. Their relationship had grown slowly through shared dedication to animal welfare, eventually blossoming into something that filled the empty spaces both had carried for years. Her son had returned from college with renewed appreciation for his mother's work, often volunteering at the sanctuary during breaks to help care for rescued animals. The legal aftermath had brought justice but also revealed the staggering scope of the criminal enterprise that had exploited Eleanor's desperation. Dr. Patricia Hendricks received a 15-year federal sentence for racketeering and medical fraud, while the broader trafficking network faced charges in 6 states and 3 countries. Eleanor's testimony had been crucial in securing convictions that dismantled the entire operation. Tyler had testified before a congressional subcommittee investigating healthcare fraud, his articulate description of the family's ordeal helping to pass new legislation requiring transparent pricing for medical procedures and stronger oversight of insurance denial practices. The 12-year-old's poise before national media had impressed lawmakers while raising awareness about the vulnerabilities that criminals exploited in desperate families. Hope's integration into the sanctuary's breeding program offered the possibility that her offspring might someday return to the wild preserves where her parents had lived before being killed by traffickers. The red panda population remained critically endangered, but each successful birth represented hope for species survival. Hope had become a symbol of resilience that resonated far beyond wildlife conservation circles. Bear had fully recovered from the psychological trauma triggered by the trafficking discovery, his emotional stability restored through continued therapeutic work with trauma victims. Daniel often brought him to schools and veteran centers where Bear's gentle presence helped others process their own difficult experiences. The bear's ability to sense and respond to human emotional distress had become legendary among therapy animal professionals. Eleanor's relationship with Tyler had deepened through their shared ordeal, the artificial crisis initially created by criminal manipulation, ultimately strengthening their family bond. Tyler's mature understanding of the complex circumstances that had led to Eleanor's involvement with the traffickers demonstrated wisdom beyond his years. Their conversations about ethics, desperation, and forgiveness had created philosophical foundations that would serve Tyler throughout his life. The sanctuary had become a gathering place for the unconventional family that had formed through tragedy and healing. Every Sunday, Daniel and Bear would visit with Kate, joining Eleanor and Tyler for what they'd begun calling Hope Days, celebrations of survival and recovery that honored both the living and those lost along the way. These gatherings included memorial moments for Courage, the cub who hadn't survived, ensuring his brief life retained meaning. Eleanor had written a book about their experience, titling it Love, Lies, and Second Chances, a family's journey through healthcare fraud and wildlife trafficking. The proceeds funded a scholarship program for children of families affected by medical fraud, while the book's success had made Eleanor a sought-after speaker at medical ethics conferences and anti-trafficking events. Tyler's college plans now centered on veterinary medicine with a specialization in wildlife conservation, his career path directly inspired by Hope's rescue and recovery. He'd already been accepted into several early admission programs, with universities competing to recruit the young man whose advocacy work had gained national recognition. Eleanor took pride in Tyler's accomplishments while marveling at how trauma had been transformed into purpose. The Christmas morning gathering at the sanctuary had become an annual tradition that drew the extended family together in celebration of their collective healing. Tyler had prepared a special presentation about Hope's development over the past 6 months, complete with photos documenting her growth from the nearly dead cub they'd found in the suitcase to the healthy, playful ambassador she'd become. Hope herself seemed to understand the significance of these gatherings, displaying her most charming behaviors when the group assembled. Her ability to interact safely with Bear continued to amaze wildlife experts, suggesting that early trauma could be overcome through patient care and consistent love. The unlikely friendship between the massive bear and tiny red panda had been featured in National Geographic, bringing international attention to the sanctuary's work. Eleanor's final court appearance had taken place the previous month, with Judge Patricia Coleman delivering a sentence that reflected both the severity of Eleanor's involvement and the extraordinary circumstances that had led to her recruitment. The judge's comments about the case had been widely quoted. Mrs. Ashford's actions remind us that good people can make terrible choices when placed in impossible situations by those who would exploit their love. As the family gathered around Hope's enclosure on that December morning, watching Tyler gently stroke the red panda's fur while Bear maintained his protective presence nearby, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't experienced since before Tyler's illness began. The nightmare that had started with manipulated medical bills and desperate choices had transformed into something beautiful, a chosen family united by shared trauma and collective healing. "You know what I'm most grateful for?" Tyler said, looking up from Hope to meet Eleanor's eyes. "I'm grateful that even when people tried to use our love against us, love still won in the end." Daniel nodded, thinking of his own journey from grief-stricken widower to someone who'd found purpose in protecting others. "Love doesn't always look the way we expect it to," he observed. "Sometimes it comes through a bear who refuses to abandon a suitcase, or a grandmother who sacrifices everything for her grandson, or a little red panda who teaches us that survival is possible even after the worst things happen." Kate smiled as she watched Bear position himself to provide shade for Hope's afternoon nap, the massive predator transformed into a gentle guardian through bonds that transcended species boundaries. "Maybe that's what family really means," she said. "Not the people you're born to, but the ones who show up when you need them most and refuse to give up on healing." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the sanctuary, Eleanor understood that their story had become something larger than personal tragedy and recovery. It was a testament to the possibility of redemption, the power of truth to overcome deception, and the extraordinary capacity of love to create families where none had existed before. The journey from that terrible moment in the airport suitcase to this peaceful December afternoon had taught them all that endings could become beginnings, that broken hearts could heal stronger than before, and that sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones that chose each other through circumstances that seemed designed to tear them apart. Hope stirred in her enclosure, opened one bright eye to check that her protectors remained nearby, then settled back into contented sleep in the safety of unconditional love. Dear friends, if you're watching this story unfold and feeling that familiar ache in your chest, you're not alone. So many of us at this stage of life know what it means to face impossible choices when the people we love most are in danger. Eleanor's desperate love for Tyler, Daniel's grief over losing his family, Kate's loneliness after her son left for college. These aren't just story elements, they're mirrors of our own experiences. We've all been there, haven't we? Standing at the crossroads between what's right and what feels necessary when someone we love is suffering. But here's what gives me hope about this story and about all of us. Love always finds a way. Even when we're deceived, even when we make mistakes driven by desperation, even when the system fails us, genuine love creates families where none existed before. Daniel found purpose again through Bear. Eleanor discovered redemption through saving hope. Kate built new connections through caring for others. Their family wasn't born from blood, but from showing up when it mattered most. What impossible choice have you faced for someone you love? And looking back, how did that experience change you for the better? Share your story below. We need to hear from each other.